So God's going to allow us to reject him, but then feel the full weight of what rejecting him relationally is actually like.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really work that way.
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a short video from evangelical Christian and author Sean McDowell from over on his self-titled channel, and in this one, Sean runs down a list of questions that he likes to approach atheists with. So let's see if what he's got actually addresses the issue at hand, which would be the burden of proof that he assumes with his positive God claim, or if it's all just another fallacy-laden attempt to stalemate the conversation in an effort to avoid addressing it.
Best questions to ask an atheist?
Seeing as how atheism is quite simply the individual position of not possessing a belief in the existence of a god or gods, I think it's pretty obvious that the best questions a theist could ask an atheist would be those questions that pertain to the justification for their position. That being said, the worst questions you could possibly ask would be those questions that have absolutely nothing to do with atheism, like questions focused on evolution or abiogenesis, cosmology, neuroscience, psychology, or sociology, or any other field that focuses on evidence to support explanations for various phenomena. So what do you have for us, Sean?
What do you mean by atheism?
Okay, I guess that's as good a place to start as any. Agreement on terms is always important for a productive conversation. The first point to make here is that atheism pertains to belief, not knowledge, which, while the two are related, are not the same thing. Knowledge being those propositions that are held to be true because they are backed by evidence that corresponds with reality and they can survive critical examination independent from one's personal experiences, while beliefs are more directly centered upon one's subjective personal experience. As beliefs are not things that an individual actively chooses to hold, but are instead things that an individual is convinced of the truth of via sufficient argumentation and/or evidence, with the extent to which one eliminates or refuses to eliminate any preconceptions they may hold, acting as the sole limiter to what that individual can or cannot be convinced of, then a person who is not convinced of the truth of the god or gods claims being presented thus does not believe in that god or those gods and is definitionally an atheist. On a side note, given what beliefs are, I have always held that the main reasoning behind why Christians attack the atheist position by referencing completely unrelated topics is because their actual goal is to try and expose the atheist as holding some form of personal bias that would preclude them from possibly being convinced. Which of course is a tactic that really only exposes their own personal bias against the logical possibility that they could be wrong.
When did you become an atheist?
The answer to this will of course vary from person to person. Some people, like myself, deconstructed and eventually deconverted, while others were never indoctrinated into religious beliefs, while still others don't come to that position until much later in life. I myself began my deconstruction about a year after my confirmation in the Methodist faith, and it was a journey that lasted about a decade, and at the end of it I knew I was an atheist. But given that I was living in Texas at the time, it wouldn't be for a couple more years after that until I was socially comfortable enough to be open as one.
Did you ever believe in God?
Yes, like many atheists before me, there was a time when I completely believed that a God existed. I was born into and raised in the faith by my parents, and being at that young age, I had no reason to question them. I was simply too young and too uneducated to realize that my reasons for believing were terrible, and that my methods for rationalizing away all of the logical issues entailed by those beliefs were even worse.
What's your experience with Christians?
Throughout the course of my life so far, I would have to say that my experiences with Christians have been more positive than negative. Despite an all too common proclivity for passive-aggressive or pretentious behavior, the majority of Christians that I've interacted with haven't been all that problematic. When they find out I'm an atheist, and if they're simply unable to handle that fact, they usually just turn around and toddle off back to their echo chambers. No harm, no foul. But it's also been my experience that when some versions of Christians have a level of protection against immediate argument and rebuke, a personal security afforded by things like the pulpit and the internet, that the worst behaviors tend to come out, but in those instances it's just flaccid posturing. And to address the question that you're really asking, Sean, no, it was not the overall behaviors of Christians that led me to being an atheist, as concluding that a God doesn't exist simply because its believers tend to act like pretentious passive-aggressive dicks would of course be a non sequitur.
What, if anything, might cause you to reconsider your beliefs?
Well, that's actually pretty simple. Independently verifiable evidence of the existence of a God would of course be the strongest, because it would then logically entail that I could no longer be an atheist. Convincing me to be a Christian, however, well, that's a conversation that demands answers to some pretty tough questions that Christians may find particularly difficult to reconcile. And if at any point the justification requires acquiescing to a faith position, then it's never gonna happen.
Those are the kinds of questions I like to begin with.
Yeah, I know. Because the tactic that you're employing with these questions, Sean, is akin to a person who has made the claim that they're psychic hot reading the target of their grift.
I am very, very sneaky, sir.
These opener questions allow the believer to gather enough information to work with in what will obviously next be their attempt to try and convince the non-believer of the truth of their God claim. And this is simply because presenting their God arguments in a vacuum have proven wholly unsuccessful, and so they naturally have to assume that there is some information in the non-believer's background creating a bias that is driving them to unjustifiably be an atheist, which again is just their own personal bias against the logical possibility of being wrong rearing its head.
Now eventually I want to get to the big question.
You mean like, what independently verifiable evidence do you have that your particular version of this proposed entity exists? I for one think that would be a pretty good place to start.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
Because nothing is an incoherent concept. Thus, there has always been something. But just because we don't currently know what that something is or was, or what the state of it might be or might have been, is not a justification for believing that something is your God. The answer to this should have been fairly obvious on its face, and it should have also been obvious that it has nothing to do with atheism.
Where did life come from?
Again, another question that has nothing to do with atheism. The fact that I'm an atheist is not predicated upon my understanding of the hypothesis of abiogenesis. Also, the logically possible existence of a creating entity and the logically possible truth of abiogenesis are not mutually exclusive. So if I were to appeal to abiogenesis in an attempt to justify my atheism, that would of course be a non sequitur. Advice from an old hunter, Sean. If you want to trap something, make sure you set it where your target actually is.
Origin of consciousness.
And again, nothing to do with atheism. The current evidence that we have to work with indicates that consciousness is an emergent property of a functioning brain, and the depth and capacity of that consciousness is directly correlated with the extent of the functionality of that brain. But even if we knew none of that, it would not be evidence or even justification for claiming that a God was the answer.
Objective moral values and duties.
While I'm still waiting for a question that actually pertains to atheism, unless of course, Sean, you can provide some actual evidence for something that dictates what morality must necessarily be in this universe, then morality is completely subjective to the individual, and the social moral frameworks that we subscribe to are a result of what the collective agrees to impose upon the society that they live in. And you're also forgetting one major issue, Sean. If your God were to actually exist, morality would necessarily be subjective, seeing as how you define your God as a mind, and that nothing exists external of your God to dictate what morality must necessarily be or not be, then any desired logically possible moral framework that this entity could impose upon any logically possible system it created would necessarily be dependent upon its mind.
And who is Jesus?
As far as the evidence we have goes, the character of Jesus as depicted in the Bible was, at bare minimum, given the proclivity of ancient Jews to co-opt the belief systems of other cultures in an effort to popularize their own, a literary amalgamation of a number of other legendary hero myths that were known throughout the ancient world, and at most a heretical rabbi who established a cult that challenged the authority of the temple and was subsequently executed for heresy. Basically nothing more than the David Koresh of Iron Age Palestine. But even if the character was an actual person who walked the earth, that would in no way be evidence that this particular individual was supernatural in nature. Also, my being an atheist is not predicated upon the logical possibility of mythicism, so I really don't know why you would ask this, Sean.
But to me, those questions are often downstream from first getting to know the person and hearing their story.
Well, of course you'd want to gather as much background information on the subject as you can, because the more background information you have on the person you're talking to, the easier it is to identify any kind of a personal experience they might have had and then twist that into a personal bias that you can use against them, which again is just you assuming that the holding of any particular bias is logically entailed by being a non-believer, because you yourself have been convinced that you cannot logically possibly be wrong in your assertion. And I also get that many atheists out there may not realize what you're actually doing. doing. And many of them may be justifying being an atheist for bad reasons, which, by the way, is not something Christians are excluded from. But that fact alone, Sean, exposes that your intentional targets are those that present the lowest hanging fruit among non-believers. And if all you ever do is punch down, then what exactly is that saying about your own courage regarding your convictions? When you're able to acknowledge and drop your indoctrinated bias and approach atheists with questions that actually pertain to atheism, then and only then can we possibly bridge the divide by having a productive conversation. But until that time arrives, your predatory behavior will only serve to continue widening the unnecessary societal divisions between theists and atheists. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 5th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, or support the podcast is down in the description. Once again, a huge thank you to each and every single one of you for supporting this channel, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.